and design. If you've been asking yourself questions like these about the other existential risks I've talked about so far in this series, then you may have already hit upon the idea that we might need a singleton to guide us through the coming years to technological maturity. A singleton, in the sense that Nick Bostrum has applied it to existential risks, is a body capable of making the final decision for everyone on the planet. I'll let him explain it.
A singleton is just a world order where at the highest level of decision-making, there is only one decision-making process. So in other words, a world is where global coordination problems, or at least the most severe global coordination problems, have been solved. So no more wars or arms races or technology races or pollution and destruction of the global commons.
One of the biggest challenges we will face in the coming decades and centuries is coordinating on a global level. In other words, getting everyone to agree on the best way to move forward in addressing existential risks. We will need to study the issues, funnel some of the world's brightest minds toward identifying future existential risks, throw lots and lots of money at the problems, and figure out the best, safest way forward toward technological maturity. But all the study, bright ideas, intricately mapped ways forward don't amount to anything if one person can undermine everything with a single accident. So we will need every single country on Earth to buy into this process. Right now, the geopolitical arrangement on Earth is based on the sovereignty of nations. Each country has its own borders and citizenry, and it's up to the country's government to make its own decisions. There are lots of exceptions to this. Some governments make agreements that stitch their nations together to some degree, as seen in the European Union or the North American Free Trade Agreement. And sometimes, one nation will invade another nation, resorting to force to influence the other government's decisions. For the most part, though, the nations of the world leave it to the other nations of the world to make their own choices about how they function. This won't really work in tackling existential risks. We will need to all agree to abide by whatever we decide is the best way to proceed. But getting to this level of consensus can be messy, and you could see just how it could get that way with existential risks by taking a look at how humans have dealt with climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is an offshoot of the United Nations that was set up back in 1988 to study climate change and provide the world's governments with the best science about the issue and how to tackle it. An issue like climate change requires international cooperation because climate change affects everyone. It crosses the borders of the world, and so not only does it affect everyone, it also requires action from everyone. To combat climate change, we need the cooperation of all nations for the collective public good. And it's exactly the same with existential risks. The IPCC was chartered during a time when global geopolitics respects the sovereignty of nations. And that has proven a problem for it. To take one example, back in 2007, when the IPCC issued its fourth assessment on global climate change, the body's reports on the current cutting-edge scientific understanding of the issue, word spread to media that the report had been watered down by diplomacy. Saudi Arabia, one of the world's leading producers of fossil fuels, and China and the United States, two of the world's leading producers of emissions from burning those fossil fuels, used their influence to temper the report's findings on how fossil fuel use contributes to climate change, to make fossil fuels' role seem less scientifically certain. As a result, the public was presented with findings that seemed much more doubtful about the role of fossil fuel emissions in climate change, a doubt that's still alive today. This could not be allowed to happen with existential risks. Climate change is one of the most important issues facing humanity today. Existential risks are the most important. So how do we create a body that's immune to diplomatic and economic pressures of countries as strong as the US, Saudi Arabia, and China? The answer is a singleton. Our hypothetical singleton could arise from an international body organized to study and deal with existential risks. Let's call it our Existential Risks Commission. Just out of necessity, as the world wakes up to the real scope and severity of these risks, we may give that commission an enormous amount of power to override any nation's opposition to its findings and guidelines, which would mean an enormous change for global geopolitics, but one we would likely feel was necessary. Our Existential Risks Commission would need to have teeth. One way it might ensure compliance among all nations is through a global surveillance network. We would need to keep tabs on all the scientists who work in fields that pose an existential threat to make sure that they weren't secretly working on designs or experiments the Commission deemed too risky to pursue. Same goes for corporations that make products that use risky technology. Our Commission would need to keep tabs on everyone, really, to monitor for signs of a black market developing in banned technology. So each government would be required to set up a surveillance network within its own borders, and the Existential Risks Commission would have access and ultimate control over all of them. It should probably also monitor each nation's government as well. And we would probably also need to grant our commission with some sort of military or policing power, as a last resort, with a force that is capable of overwhelming any nations in the world. Or perhaps, to make it easier, we would just allow the Commission to disband the world's militaries and maintain its own small force it could use to invade and easily occupy any non-complying nation. With a single decision-making body in charge of determining the best way forward toward technological maturity, one equipped with unchecked authority, able to monitor every person alive on the planet, and to use the threat of violence to ensure that we all stay in line on our march toward a safe future, we may just make it through the next century or two and arrive at a point where the future of humanity is assured. But as you may have noticed as I was describing it, a singleton can also pose an existential threat itself. That same global body we create to manage our existential risks could easily become totalitarian, forming a permanent global dictatorship that no future generation could possibly overthrow. And it's about here that you might start to feel like no matter what we do, humanity is doomed.